Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Introduction continued. Now, if we inquire into the truth of knowledge, it seems that we are asking what knowledge is in itself. Yet in this inquiry, knowledge is our object, something that exists for us, and the in itself that would supposedly result from it would rather be the being of knowledge for us. What we asserted to be its essence would be not so much its truth, but rather just our knowledge of it. The essence or criterion would lie within ourselves, and that which was to be compared with it, and about which a decision would be reached, through this comparison would not necessarily have to recognise the validity of such a standard. But the dissociation of all this semblance of dissociation and presuppositions is overcome by the nature of the object we are investigating. Consciousness provides its own criterion from within itself, so that the investigation becomes a comparison of consciousness with itself. For the distinction made above falls within it. In consciousness one thing exists for another, or another. That is, consciousness regularly contains the determinateness of the moment of knowledge. At the same time, this other is to consciousness, not merely for it, but is also outside of this relationship or exists in itself, the moment of truth. Thus, in what consciousness affirms from within itself as being in itself, for the true, we have the standard which consciousness itself sets up by which to measure what it knows. If we designate knowledge as the notion, but the essence or the true as what exists, or the object, then the examination consists in seeing whether the notion corresponds to the object. But if we call the essence or in itself of the object the notion, and on the other hand understand by the object the notion itself as object, namely as it exists or for another, that should say, then the examination consists in seeing whether the object corresponds to its notion. It is evident, of course, that the two procedures are the same, but the essential point to bear in mind throughout the whole investigation is that these two moments, notion and object, being for another and being in itself, both fall within that knowledge which we are investigating. Consequently, we do not need to import criteria or to make use of our own bright ideas and thoughts during the course of the inquiry. It is precisely when we leave these aside that we succeed in contemplating the matter in hand as it is in and for itself. But not only is a contribution by us superfluous, since notion and object, the criterion and what is to be tested, are present in consciousness itself, but we are also spared the trouble of comparing the two and really testing them, so that since what consciousness examines is its own self, all that is left for us to do is simply to look on. For consciousness is, on the one hand, consciousness of the object, and on the other, consciousness of itself, consciousness of what for it is the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of the truth. Since both are for the same consciousness, this consciousness is itself their comparison. It is for this same consciousness to know whether its knowledge of the object corresponds to the object or not. The object, it is true, seems only to be for consciousness, in the way that consciousness knows it. It seems that consciousness cannot, as it were, get behind the object, as it exists for consciousness, so as to examine what the object is in itself, and hence, too, cannot test its own knowledge by that standard. But the distinction between the in itself and knowledge is already present in the very fact that consciousness knows an object at all. Something is for it, the in itself, and knowledge, or the being of the object for consciousness, is for it another moment. Upon this distinction, which is present as a fact, the examination rests. If the comparison shows that these two moments do not correspond to one another, it would seem that consciousness must alter its knowledge to make it conform to the object. But in fact, in the alteration of the knowledge, the object itself alters for it too. For the knowledge that was present was essentially a knowledge of the object. As the knowledge changes, so too does the object, for it essentially belonged to this knowledge. Hence it comes to pass for consciousness that what it previously took to be the in itself is not an in itself, or that it was only an in itself for consciousness. Since consciousness thus finds that its knowledge does not correspond to its object, the object itself does not stand the test. In other words, the criterion to testing is altered when that for which was to have been the criterion fails to pass the test, and the testing is not only a testing of what we know, but also a testing of the criterion of what knowing is. Inasmuch as the new true object issues from it, this dialectical movement, which consciousness exercises on itself, and which affects both its knowledge and its object, is precisely what is called experience. In this connection, there is a moment in the process just mentioned, which must be brought out more clearly, for through it a new light will be thrown on the exposition which follows. Consciousness knows something. This object is the essence or the in itself, but it is also for consciousness the in itself. This is where the ambiguity of this truth enters. We see that consciousness now has two objects. One is the first in itself, the second is the being for consciousness of this in itself. The latter appears at first sight to be merely the reflection of consciousness into itself. That is, what consciousness has in mind is not an object, but only its knowledge of that first object. But as was shown previously, the first object in being known is altered for consciousness. It ceases to be the in itself and becomes something that is the in itself only for consciousness. And this then is the true. The being for consciousness of this in itself, or in other words, this is the essence or the object of consciousness. This new object contains the nothingness of the first. It is what experience has made of it. This exposition of the course of experience contains a moment in virtue of which it does not seem to agree with what is ordinarily understood by experience. This is the moment of transition from the first object and the knowledge of it to the other object, which experience is said to be about. Our account implied that our knowledge of the first object, or the being for consciousness of the first in itself becomes the second object. It usually seems to be the case, on the contrary, that our experience of the untruth of the first notion comes by way of a second object, which we come upon by chance and externally, so that our part in all this is simply the pure apprehension of what is in and for itself. For the present viewpoint, however, the new object shows itself to have come about through a reversal of consciousness itself. This way of looking at the matter is something contributed by us, by means of which the succession of experiences through which consciousness passes is raised into a scientific progression, but it is not known to the consciousness that we are observing. But, as a matter of fact, we have here the same situation as the one discussed in regard to the relation between our exposition and skepticism, namely that in every case the result of an untrue mode of knowledge must not be allowed to run away into an empty nothing, but must necessarily be grasped as the nothing of that from which it results, a result which contains what was true in the preceding knowledge. It shows up here like this, since what first appeared as the object sinks for consciousness to the level of sway of knowing it, and since the in itself becomes a being for consciousness of the in itself, the latter is now the new object. Herewith a new pattern of consciousness comes on the scene as well, of which the essence is something different from what it was at the preceding stage. It is this fact that guides the entire series of the patterns of consciousness in their necessary sequence, but it is just this necessity itself, or the origination of the new object, that presents itself to consciousness without its understanding how this happens, which proceeds for us, as it were, behind the back of consciousness. Thus, in the movement of consciousness, there occurs a moment of being in itself, or being for us, which is not present to the consciousness comprehended in the experience itself. The content, however, of what presents itself to us does exist for it. We comprehend only the formal aspect of that content, or its pure origination. For it, what has thus arisen exists only as an object for us. It appears at the same time as movement and a process of becoming. Because of this necessity, the way to science is itself already science, and hence, in virtue of its content, is the science of the experience of consciousness. The experience of itself, which consciousness goes through, can, in accordance with its notion, comprehend nothing less than the entire system of consciousness, or the entire realm of the truth of spirit. For this reason, the moments of this truth are exhibited in their own proper determinateness, namely as being not abstract moments, but as they are for consciousness, or as consciousness itself stands forth in its relation to them. Thus the moments of the whole are patterns of consciousness. In pressing forward to its true existence, consciousness will arrive at a point which it gets rid of its semblance of being burdened with something alien, with what is only for it, and some sort of other, at a point where appearance becomes identical with essence, so that its exposition will coincide at just this point with the authentic science of spirit, and finally, when consciousness itself grasps this its own essence, it will signify the nature of absolute knowledge itself.